The air burned her lungs. It smelled of crushed pine and fatal chemistry. Wren walked through the choking green haze, stepping over the writhing bodies of her own pack's elite guards. She kept her eyes off the damp moss, locking instead on the blood-soaked monster rising from the silver nets ahead. Vane. He was breathing hard, toxic smoke curling around his brutal jaw. She pressed a small glass vial into his slick hand. The image vanished. The scent of smoke faded into the metallic tang of fresh blood. The moss became cold linoleum. Wren blinked the sweat from her eyes, forcing her focus back to the Silver Ridge Infirmary. She was up to her elbows in a gaping chest wound. The scout on the metal table thrashed, fighting for air. He was barely 17 and his throat was nearly gone. Hold him down. 2 lower-ranking wolves pinned his shoulders. The room was dead quiet except for the wet tear of Wren's needle-piercing skin. She tied off a suture. The boy whimpered, a wet, rattling sound. He hadn't been attacked by rogues. That was the official lie. Alpha Silas had used this boy to test the Shadow Pack's border traps. Silas treated his people like disposable pawns, and Wren was the one who had to clean up the blood. It hurts. The boy rasped, his terrified eyes rolling toward her. Wren made a choice. She bypassed the pack-approved gauze in her apron and found the tiny, corked vial hidden at the bottom. It was a concentrated narcotic she'd brewed from forbidden nightshade. If Silas found it, she'd be flogged. He didn't care. Leaning over the boy to block the other's view, she popped the cork. "Open your mouth," she murmured. He obeyed. She tipped 2 drops onto his tongue. His eyes glazed over instantly, his limbs going limp against the table as his breathing slowed to a deep hum. He was under. Wren slipped the vial away. To the pack, she was just Wren, the lowest-ranking herb picker. The frail human kept around out of pity. They had no idea what she held in the palm of her hand. She wiped her forehead. The quiet broke. The heavy infirmary doors slammed open. Arrogant footsteps sounded against the floorboards, and the room grew cold, flooding with the scent of cedar and ozone. The 2 wolves holding the boy dropped to their knees, exposing their necks. Wren didn't look up from her sutures. She knew who it was. Alpha Silas. "Get this mess off my table." Silas didn't need to shout. His low drawl commanded the room. He stopped at the edge of the table, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket, irritated by the blood on his boots. "He's still breathing, Alpha," Wren said flatly, shielding the boy with her small frame. She clasped her hands in front of her apron to hide the tremor. Silas smiled, a slow, mocking stretch of his lips. He invaded her space until she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "My dear Wren." He dragged a knuckle down her cheek, leaving a smear of the boy's blood. "You try so hard. But some messes cannot be cleaned." He failed his patrol. A tragic loss. She knew he was lying. "He needs a transfusion. And better supplies." Her voice cracked just a fraction. It was a mistake. Silas's smile vanished. He leaned in, his whisper making the hair on her arms stand up. "You are a human scavenger living off the scraps of my pack. Do not presume to tell me how to allocate my resources." He turned his back, waving a dismissive hand at his guards. "Toss the boy outside the perimeter. If he survives the night, he can rejoin the ranks." "No." Wren lunged, grabbing his sleeve. Touching an alpha without permission was treason. Silas spun, his fingers locking around her jaw like a vice. He lifted her onto her toes. His claws extended, piercing the soft skin beneath her ears. Hot blood trickled down her neck. "You forget your place, little bird." Wren choked, clawing at his iron grip. His eyes flared a brilliant gold. But he didn't strike her. His grip loosened just enough for her to breathe, and that terrifying cold smile returned. "Actually, your timing is impeccable. I have a problem and you are the perfect solution." He dropped her. She hit the floor, coughing and clutching her bruised throat. "The Shadow Pack is restless," Silas said, straightening his jacket. "They demand a peace offering before treaty negotiations. A gesture of good faith to cross their borders." Wren froze. The reality settled like a stone in her stomach. "You are scentless. Expendable. You will go into the ancestral forest tonight." He stepped over her, walking toward the doors. "Pack your herbs, scavenger." The iron lock clicked on the outside of the door. Wren was alone in the windowless apothecary. It smelled of dried lavender, sage, and damp earth. For 5 years, it had been her sanctuary. Now it was a tomb. The panic that gripped her throat earlier faded into a hollow numbness. Silas expected her to cry. He expected her to walk into the mist like a lamb to the slaughter. He was wrong. Wren walked to her wooden workbench. Her hands were steady now. She reached for her satchel, ignoring the standard linen and healing salves, and pulled out the locked iron box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside sat a collection of wax-sealed glass jars, her private array of deadly flora. She grabbed a heavy stone mortar and pestle. From the darkest jar she took a handful of dried, silvery roots. Wolfsbane, but not the standard kind. This was a mutated strain she'd bred over 3 winters, fatal to lichens upon blood contact. She dropped the roots into the bowl. Crunch. She pressed down, grinding them into a shimmering ash. The bitter scent burned the back of her throat, but she kept grinding. Her mind was pure calculation. The shadow pack tore trespassers apart. She was a dead woman walking, but she wouldn't let Silas win without a price. When the roots were reduced to toxic powder, she unbuttoned the collar of her shirt to expose her throat. She dipped 2 fingers into the bowl and rubbed the lethal ash directly into her skin, dusting her pulse points until it embedded in her pores. It burned like fire, but she bit her cheek to stay silent. Any wolf that bit her throat would ingest a fatal dose. She buttoned her shirt to the top, hiding the trap, and packed the remaining spores and a hollowed-out gourd of raw nitrates into her satchel. Heavy boots echoed in the hallway. The door swung open. It's time. Wren faced the guards. Beneath her collar, the poison burned like a second heartbeat. Lead the way. The mist swallowed them whole. Wren stumbled as a guard shoved her forward. She caught herself on the damp bark of an ancient redwood, boots slipping on rotting leaves. Keep moving, the Silver Ridge guard ordered. He was a seasoned warrior, yet his eyes darted through the fog. He was terrified. The 2 guards flanking her walked with hunched shoulders, flinching at every snapped twig. They had crossed into Shadowpack territory. The air tasted of old iron and wet earth. The silence pressed heavily against her eardrums. This is far enough, the lead guard hissed, stepping back so quickly he nearly tripped. Run. Within seconds they were gone, their footsteps fading into the fog. Wren was alone. She was tethered bait. She closed her eyes and breathed in. The faint, bitter sting of the wolfsbane ash on her throat grounded her. She squared her shoulders and pulled her collar slightly wider, exposing the dusted skin over her jugular. Come on, she whispered to the trees. The mist swirled and broke apart. 5 wolves materialized from the whiteout. They were massive, their fur pitch black, eyes glowing like cold embers. They circled her, their low growls vibrating through the soles of her boots. Then the largest of them, a heavily scarred beast, shimmered. Bones cracked and realigned. A man stepped out of the mist. Vane, the feral king. He was naked, his skin painted with dirt and blood. His eyes were wild. Merciless. He locked eyes with her and walked forward. This was it. Wren planted her boots in the dirt, knees trembling. Vane closed the distance with predatory grace, his chest rising and falling. He was going to rip her throat out. She squeezed her eyes shut and braced for the pain, waiting for his jaws to crush her neck and the poison to stop his heart. He lunged. She felt the sudden displacement of air as his heat slammed into her space. But the bite never came. Instead, a ragged gasp ripped from his chest. His boots skidded in the dirt. Wren snapped her eyes open. Vane was frozen inches from her face, hands curled into claws. His pupils were blown black, swallowing the color of his irises. He leaned in, his nose brushing the edge of her collarbone, hovering millimeters above the poisoned ash. He inhaled. A shuddering breath rattled in his lungs. Why wasn't he biting? Wren's cold logic fractured into panic. He flinched, wrinkling his nose at the chemical bite of the ash. But then he buried his face just below her ear, breathing in the scent beneath the poison. Whine. The word was a guttural scrape. Wren's stomach dropped. An electric jolt sparked down her spine, a biological pull so intense it made her dizzy. The mate bond was supposed to be a myth. And she was human. Scentless. Vane stumbled backward, looking at her like she was a ghost. The dominance of his presence warred with the chaos in his eyes. Why Alpha? One of the wolves behind him asked. Vane swallowed hard. The feral madness in his gaze solidified into something much more dangerous. Obsession. Bind her, he ordered. Take the human alive. The ropes bit into her wrists. Wren forced her breathing to steady as two shadow warriors dragged her through the camouflaged encampment. She replaced her panic with the analytical detachment of a healer diagnosing a wound. The camp was a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. Tents woven from vines and moss blended seamlessly into the forest. She counted at least 40 elite warriors with unpolished steel weapons. They watched her with disgust, seeing only a frail peace offering. They had no idea she was coated in enough neurotoxin to wipe out half their vanguard. Inside, a guard shoved her into a dim holding tent. She fell to her knees on the packed earth as the thick leather flap shut behind her. She scrambled backward until her spine hit the central support pole, listening to the guards take up positions outside. She was alive. Vane hadn't killed her. But the terrifying intensity in his eyes when he inhaled her scent scared her more than a quick death. What did he want with her? A wet cough shattered her thoughts. A sickening, rattling wheeze. Wren crawled to the edge of the tent and pressed her eye to a tear in the seam. Outside, one of her massive escorts was on his hands and knees, clutching his chest. He coughed again and a thick spray of black blood hit the dirt. The warrior groaned in unnatural agony before collapsing face first into the mud, twitching violently. Wren's breath caught. She recognized that blood. She recognized the speed of the collapse. Engineered nightshade. Silas hadn't just sent her to die. He had sent her as a distraction. The camp erupted into organized chaos. Shouts echoed through the redwoods. Get the healers. Now. A second guard carrying firewood stumbled, dropping the wood before letting out an agonizing gasp. He hit the dirt, his spine arching as black blood sprayed from his lips. 3 elderly wolves rushed over with burning sage and willow bark. One pressed his hands against the first fallen guard's chest, looking up with terrified eyes. They didn't know what they were dealing with. But Wren did. Even through the slit in the tent she saw the spiderweb pattern of pitch-black veins creeping up the guard's neck. Vascular discoloration. Rapid respiratory failure. Internal hemorrhaging. It was a textbook execution of engineered nightshade. Silas's scouts had poisoned the Shadow Pack's underground spring while she kept the border guards occupied. A twisted knot of validation curled in her stomach. The Silver Ridge wolves treated her like dirt, yet her alpha had just crippled a vanguard of apex predators without lifting a claw. The validation turned to ash when the guard let out a high-pitched wheeze. It sounded exactly like the boy in the infirmary. The crowd parted. Vane stalked into the center of the clearing, fully dressed in dark leathers. He grabbed the lead healer, demanding answers, but the healer just shook his head in a panic. Vane released him and stood perfectly still. Slowly he turned his head, his glowing eyes locking directly onto Wren's holding tent. The leather ties snapped as Vane tore the entryway open. He filled the space, bringing the scent of ozone, crushed pine and panic. What did you bring into my camp? His voice vibrated in the soles of her boots. Wren scrambled back against the wooden support pole, pulling her knees to her chest. Nothing. I brought nothing. She let her voice shake, leaning into the role of the terrified human. My men are bleeding from the inside out. He crouched in front of her. The heat radiating from his chest felt like a furnace. What sickness does Silver Ridge carry? Tell me. I don't know. She squeezed her eyes shut with a breathless sob. I'm just a gatherer. I pick herbs. They don't tell me anything. She was lying through omission and the truth sat heavy on her tongue. Vane leaned closer. The intense hum of the mate bond sparked between them, an electric current that made her teeth ache. She fought the urge to lean into his heat. His gaze scanned her face, searching for a lie. He found nothing but a wide-eyed, trembling girl. Then he stared at her collarbone. The faint, bitter scent of the wolfsbane ash still clung to her skin. His jaw tightened. Useless, he spat. He pushed himself up and turned toward the flap. As the leather fell shut behind him, a heavy thud shook the ground outside. Another wolf had fallen. Night settled over the canopy. The holding tent was pitch black. Wren paced the dirt floor. 5 steps forward, turn 5 steps back. The camp outside was thick with the sound of wheezing. A wet chorus of dying lungs echoed from dozens of tents. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound was in her blood. She remembered the young scout. She remembered Silas wiping blood on her cheek. Silas had poured the poison, and he was probably laughing in his fortress while these wolves drowned in their own fluids. She knew exactly how the toxin worked. She knew the volatile botanicals required to strip the poison and shock the respiratory system back to life. She held the cure in her mind. If she let the sun rise over a camp of corpses, she was no longer a healer. She'd be exactly what Silas molded her to be. The healer's oath drummed against her skull. Do no harm. The paralyzing fear evaporated, replaced by the undeniable logic of chemistry. She was the most dangerous thing in this forest. Wren dropped her hands and marched to the tent flap. She kicked the heavy leather aside. The cold night air hit her face, revealing a graveyard of writhing bodies. Alpha, she screamed. Her voice cut through the wheezing like a steel blade. Alpha Vane. Get out here. A cold steel blade pressed flat against her windpipe. Before she could even lower her arms, a Shadow Pack general slammed her against the tent pole. You will shut your mouth, human. The general's eyes were black, his fangs extended. Hot saliva dripped onto her shoulder. He smelled of iron and rage. The crowd parted. Vane stepped into the firelight. He stalked forward, his gaze locked on the general. Let her go. It was a low-frequency command that rattled the teeth in Wren's skull. The general hesitated. She summoned it, Alpha. She called the sickness. I said let her go. The general dropped his arm and bared his throat in submission. Wren slumped forward, catching herself and rubbing her raw neck. Dozens of furious, desperate wolves surrounded her. She was terrified, but a wall of logic slammed down in her mind. They are dying from water toxicity, she said flatly. She took a step forward. It is an engineered nightshade root. A synthesized belladonna alkaloid, laced with crushed hemlock and dried foxglove. Silas didn't poison your meat. He poisoned your spring. It takes 4 hours to metabolize, which means every wolf who drank after sundown will be dead by dawn. The camp went dead quiet. Vane stared down at her, his dominance pressing against her chest. She refused to look away. The meek herb gatherer was dead. The general snarled. She confesses. She poisoned the water. Vane moved. He didn't just step between Wren and the charging general. He slammed his forearm into the general's chest, throwing the wolf backward into the dirt. Vane stood as a living shield between Wren and his pack. The mate bond flared, a suffocating wave of protective heat. But Wren didn't cower behind his back. She stepped around him. Put the blade down, she directed at the general in the dirt. If I wanted you dead, you would already be rotting. I am a healer. And right now, I am the only thing standing between your alpha and a graveyard. She turned on her heel to face Vane. He was so large, so powerful, yet he stood perfectly still under her gaze. I need a sterile workspace. I need boiling water. And I need a mortar and pestle large enough to crush bone. Vane searched her face. The terrified girl was gone. What else? He rasped. Wren stepped closer. I need charcoal. Pure sulfur. And the root of the black blood orchid. The general gasped. Blood orchid is fatal. It will stop their hearts. Wren held Vane's gaze. It will bind to the belladonna and strip it from their vascular system. If the measurements are off by a fraction of a gram, it will kill them instantly. The fate of the pack hung on the chemistry of a human girl. Vane inhaled deeply, pulling her scent into his lungs. He wasn't smelling the poison anymore. He was smelling her truth. He looked over her head. Get her what she needs. Now. The heavy canvas flap of the medical tent dropped shut. The space was stifling hot. Wren threw off her satchel and rolled up her sleeves. 2 hostile guards watched her every move from the entryway. She ignored them. The wooden table was piled high with the deadly botanicals she had demanded. The scent of sulfur and crushed stems was dizzying. She sorted, crushed, and measured. A pinch of charcoal. A scoop of sulfur. She grabbed the tough, dark root of the blood orchid. She dropped it into the stone bowl and slammed the heavy iron pestle down. Prick. The root barely dented. Prick. Her arms burned. She was human. She didn't have the brute strength to pulverize the resin fast enough. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Outside, the agonizing coughs were growing quieter. They were drowning. The iron pestle slipped and Wren let out a frustrated hiss. The canvas flap tore open. The guards dropped their heads as Vane stepped inside. He looked exhausted, the edges of his eyes tight with the strain of watching his family suffocate. He dismissed the guards with a flick of his wrist. Vane walked to the table. He didn't look at the boiling water or the herbs. He saw her trembling arms and the desperation in her features. He stepped right beside her, the heat rolling off his skin smelling of rain and raw power. He reached out, his massive blood-slicked hand wrapping over her trembling fingers on the pestle. "They are dying," he whispered. "Show me how to help." His calloused palm pressed down hard on the iron pestle. "Let go," her voice was barely a whisper. She kept her eyes locked on the stone bowl. "I can do the crushing. You just tell me when to stop." He pulled his hand back just enough to take the heavy iron from her grip. The only sound in the tent was the brutal crack of the iron pestle hitting stone. The impossibly hard blood orchid root splintered into dust under his first strike. Vane was a machine, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he pulverized the deadly flora, his own lungs fighting the faint traces of nightshade. "More sulfur," Wren ordered. She dumped the pale powder into the crushed root. "Keep grinding. The friction has to heat the sulfur before we add the charcoal or it will curdle." Vane didn't argue. The apex predator was taking direct orders from a human. They worked shoulder to shoulder. When Wren leaned in to check the consistency, her shoulder brushed his bicep. An electric shock shot up her arm. The mate bond was a roaring current demanding she press against him. She forced herself to step back. "Stop." Vane froze. Wren grabbed the heavy boiling water pot and dumped the pulverized dust directly into it. A pungent white steam hissed into the air. The liquid bubbled violently. Wren grabbed a wooden paddle and stirred. If her measurements were wrong, the liquid would turn black and the pack would be dead. She stirred. Slowly, the dark liquid began to lighten. It shifted from mud to a deep blue, then settled into a glowing violet. "It's ready," she gasped. She reached for the heavy ladle. The thick canvas wall of the tent sliced open. The metallic shriek of tearing canvas was deafening. A shadow lunged through the slit. It was a man in polished leather armor, a Silver Ridge assassin sent to finish the job. The assassin hit the dirt rolling, a serrated silver dagger in his hand. His eyes locked entirely on Vane. Vane turned, but he was too slow. The toxic air had seeped into his lungs, dulling his reflexes. He reached for a weapon that wasn't there, slipping on the damp earth as he tried to put himself between the blade and Wren. The assassin lunged, driving the blade toward Vane's chest. Wren didn't scream or freeze. She dropped the ladle, her hand flying to her belt. She ripped a tightly sealed leather pouch free, tearing the drawstring open with her teeth. She stepped directly into the arc of the assassin's swing. She didn't try to block him. She crushed the pouch and blew a concentrated cloud of pale green spore powder directly into his face. It was a paralytic derived from a rare fungal bloom that attacked the central nervous system instantly. The assassin inhaled. His eyes rolled white. The silver dagger slipped from his grip, clattering against the stone table. The assassin dropped like a stone. He hit the dirt face first, his muscles seizing so violently his spine arched backward. He began to choke, fully paralyzed. Wren didn't flinch. She wiped the excess green dust from her fingers onto her apron. She felt no guilt. The man had come to murder the person shielding her, and she had neutralized him like a pest. She was exactly the monster Silas had built her to be. She stepped over the twitching body, picked up a small glass vial, and dipped it into the glowing violet antidote. She sealed it with a cork and turned around. Vane was staring at her. He was frozen, chest heaving. He looked at the assassin, then slowly met her eyes. He was looking at a human who had just dropped an elite Leakin killer in seconds without shedding a drop of blood. He wasn't disgusted. He was captivated. Wren walked up to him and pressed the warm vial into his palm. "Drink it," she commanded. "Your lungs are compromised from the ambient toxicity. Drink it now or you will be dead before we can dose your men." Vane obeyed. He popped the cork and downed the violet liquid in a single swallow. He gasped as the chemical stripped the nightshade from his blood. He coughed once, and the terrifying vitality of the apex predator flooded back into his veins. He tossed the empty vial onto the dirt and stepped into her space. The feral madness was gone, replaced by a lethal obsession. She wasn't his captive anymore. She was his equal. Wren sat still on the edge of the cot in Vane's personal tent. She rubbed her thumb over the pale green residue on her knuckles, trying to scrape away the memory of the assassin's choking gasp. She had saved the shadow pack. The antidote had worked and the horrifying wheezing had stopped. But a creeping dread settled in her stomach. She had exposed everything. She was no longer a hidden pity case from Silver Ridge. To a pack of traditional apex predators, a human with the power to slaughter their vanguard was an unnatural anomaly. Vane had watched her neutralize the assassin with cold detachment. He was going to execute her. A feral king couldn't allow her to live. The leather tent flap brushed open. Wren flinched, bracing for the guards. It was Vane. He looked exhausted, carrying the weight of his crown. He didn't look angry. He stopped in the center of the room. Silas sent a runner to the border. His voice was a gravelly rumble. Wren's pulse hammered. He doesn't know the assassin failed. He doesn't know you cured the water. Vane took a heavy step forward. He has called for the peace treaty. At dawn. In the ancestral clearing. Wren pushed herself off the cot. Her legs felt like lead. The treaty. He expects you to be dead. He expects to walk into a graveyard and claim your territory. I know. Then you cannot go. The cowardly logic of Silas's plan fell into place. Silas didn't want a negotiation. He wanted a massacre. Vane crossed his scarred arms. My men are alive, Wren. But they are weak. If I do not meet him in the clearing, Silas will use my absence as an excuse to march his vanguard directly into this camp. They will slaughter my pack in their sleep. No. I am going, Vane said, his terrifying calm worse than his rage. I will walk into the clearing alone. I will take Silas's head before his guards can draw their blades. Wren closed the distance between them, ignoring the boundaries of rank to grab the leather straps of his armor. It is a trap. Silas uses loopholes, poisons, and traps. You cannot outmaneuver him with brute strength. If you walk into that clearing alone, you will never walk out. Vane reached down, his calloused hands engulfing her waist. He pulled her flush against his chest. The mate bond roared between them. I am the Alpha of the shadows. I do not hide while my people are hunted. His glowing eyes were soft. He was a king willingly walking to the gallows to save his broken family. He leaned down and his mouth crashed over hers. It was a desperate, breathless goodbye that bruised her lips. He tasted of sulfur, rain, and devotion. He pulled away before she could kiss him back. Stay in the tent. He turned and walked out into the dark. Wren was alone. Her knees gave out and she collapsed onto the dirt floor, her chest heaving with dry sobs. She had spent her life trying to save people, but she couldn't save the one man who saw her as an equal. Silas was going to win. The tyrant would butcher the feral king and Wren would be dragged back to Silver Ridge. The thought made her sick. She stared blankly at her overturned travel satchel. The pale green spores dusted the earth next to a hollowed-out gourd she had packed for her own suicide mission. The tears stopped. The fear evaporated, replaced by an unnatural calm. She remembered Silas's sharp claws digging into her neck. Wren wiped her cheeks and grabbed the heavy wooden gourd. She unscrewed the cork and with mechanical precision, poured her raw nitrates into the cavity, layering them with highly reactive botanical dust. She wasn't building a cure. She was building a bomb. She sealed the heavy gourd with a thick layer of black wax to ensure combustive pressure. She hooked it onto her belt and strapped the remaining paralyzing spores to her thighs. Silas thought she was a harmless peace offering. He was dead wrong. Wren turned toward the tent flap. I'm coming with you, she whispered to the empty room and stepped out into the night. The mist was thick enough to choke on. Wren stepped into the freezing dark of the encampment. 30 elite warriors of the Shadow Pack Vanguard stood in disciplined silence at the edge of the tree line. At their head stood Vane, armed with a dark steel broadsword, preparing to walk into a graveyard alone. Not tonight. Wren didn't sneak. Her boots crunched loudly against the earth. 30 pairs of glowing eyes snapped toward her. A warning growl rippled through the ranks, but she didn't break her stride. She pushed past a snarling general and stopped 3 feet from Vane, blocking his path. Go back to the tent, Wren. The Alpha command vibrated in the air. She didn't blink. I am not your captive anymore, Alpha. And I am not a casualty waiting to happen. She unhooked the wax-sealed gourd and held it up between them. Silas has 30 elite royal guards with him. They will be heavily armed, waiting in the canopy. If you walk out there alone, they will pin you to the dirt before you can swing that sword. Vane stared at the gourd. I gave you an order. Wren took a step closer. You will need a distraction. I am it. The heavy silence pressed down on them. The lead general watched, waiting for Vane to drag her out of the way. Vane looked from the explosive gourd to the ice in her eyes. The feral madness in his expression faded. The corners of his mouth twitched. He didn't see a helpless girl. He saw a warlord. He gave a sharp nod to his general. Let the Luna pass. The forest was a metronome. Crunch, thud, crunch, thud. The vanguard moved through the redwoods with unified precision. Wren walked in the center of the formation, entirely hidden by the massive shadows of the wolves around her. The heat radiating from the predators kept her muscles loose. The towering general to her left matched her pace, angling his body to protect her flank. For the first time in her life she belonged. She was the tactical center of the most lethal pack in the territory. The scent of the air changed. The damp smell of rotting leaves was overpowered by wood smoke and the sickening scent of polished leather and Silver Ridge arrogance. Vane raised a hand. The entire vanguard stopped instantly. They had reached the edge of the ancestral clearing. Wren slipped between two guards until she stood behind Vane's right shoulder, peering through the fog. In the center of the clearing, a roaring ceremonial fire burned. Alpha Silas stood perfectly pristine in front of the flames, flanked by 3 elite guards with drawn swords. Wren's grip tightened around the wax seal of the gourd. Vane looked down at her, locking eyes for one agonizing second. Then he turned his back on the vanguard and stepped into the misty clearing alone. Vane stopped 10 paces from the fire. He didn't draw his sword. He simply stood there, a towering mountain of feral dominance. Alpha Silas smiled, that same mocking stretch of lips from the infirmary. Vane. The feral king of the dirt. His drawl dripped with condescension. I must admit I am surprised to see you standing. My scouts reported a terrible sickness sweeping through your camp. A tragic failure of your water supply, I believe. Vane didn't flinch. You reek of cowardice, Silas. Draw your blade. Silas laughed. A blade? Against the legendary Shadow Alpha? I rely on superior tactics, not brute savagery. He stepped backward, putting his guards between himself and Vane, and looked up into the redwood canopy. Did you really think I would walk into this forest without insurance? Silas snapped his fingers. The canopy exploded. Dozens of heavily weighted silver-barbed nets dropped from the high branches, crashing down with bone-shattering force. Vane didn't have time to react. The massive nets slammed into him, driving him to his knees. The silver barbs bit into his shoulders, burning his flesh. Vane let out a furious roar, straining against the weight, but the silver neutralized his strength, pinning him to the damp moss. Silas slowly drew his polished sword, walking toward the trapped king. Wren felt no fear. He stepped out of the mist. The sickening sizzle of burning silver filled the freezing air. Silas dragged the tip of his sword across the damp moss, taking his time. Look at you, he sneered. The great Alpha of the shadows. Brought to his knees by a little silver mesh. Your territory belongs to Silver Ridge now. And your broken pack will make excellent slaves. Wren watched from the fog. Vane didn't beg for mercy, he simply bared his fangs. Silas raised his blade, pointing it directly at the back of Vane's neck. Wren stepped fully out of the fog. Her boots crunched heavily against the dead leaves. Silas froze, his sword suspended in the air. His guards snapped their weapons toward the woods, expecting an army. Instead they saw Wren. Silas stared at her, his arrogant mind struggling to process why the frail human offering was standing unhurt in the clearing. A sharp laugh burst from his chest. The scavenger. He lowered his sword, shaking his head. You survived the woods just to come crawling right back to me? Did the feral king reject your thin blood? Wren didn't say a word. She didn't plead. She stood perfectly still, reaching down to her belt. Her fingers wrapped around the wax-sealed wooden gourd. She held it up, the firelight catching the dark wax. Silas scoffed. What exactly is that? Are you going to throw a rotten squash at me, little bird? Wren raised the gourd a little higher. Wren didn't hesitate or brace for the blast. With every ounce of strength in her small frame, she hurled the heavy gourd directly into the red-hot center of the ceremonial fire. The clearing tore open. The bone-rattling crack of a combustive explosion shook the redwoods to their roots. A wall of blistering heat slammed into Wren, stealing the breath from her lungs. A thick green smoke erupted from the blast. The highly reactive botanical dust vaporized, expanding outward in a rapid shockwave that blanketed the clearing in seconds. What? Silas's command was cut short. He inhaled the smoke. The neurotoxin hit his leaken respiratory system like a hammer. His polished sword slipped from his fingers. He brought both hands to his throat, his golden eyes rolling wildly as his lungs locked shut. The elite royal guards flanking him didn't even have time to scream. One by one the massive warriors collapsed. They hit the moss, muscles paralyzed, thrashing as they fought for air that wouldn't come. The poison bound rapidly to their enhanced nervous systems, shutting them down. Wren stood still. The toxic green fog swirled around her face. She inhaled deeply. The smoke tasted sharp and bitter, but it did nothing to her. She was human. The lethal cloud passed right through her lungs without leaving a trace of damage. She hadn't just survived. She had turned the air itself into a weapon. Wren walked forward into the poisonous fog. The frantic thrashing of the dying Silver Ridge wolves was the only sound left in the world. She reached Alpha Silas. He was flat on his back, his pristine jacket covered in mud and ash. Thick green veins bulged beneath his skin. He was choking, gasping for breath, his eyes fixed on her in helpless horror. He couldn't speak or twitch his fingers to defend himself. Wren stepped over his thrashing body without looking down. She reached the center of the clearing. Vane was pinned beneath the sizzling silver net, stubbornly holding his breath to keep the smoke out of his lungs. Wren dropped to her knees beside him. She slid a sharp silver dagger from a paralyzed guard's belt and wedged the blade under the thickest link of the weighted net. She pulled hard. The metal snapped. She sliced through the burning mesh again and again, ignoring the burns forming on her fingers, until the suffocating weight slid off Vane's back. He gasped, inhaling the green smoke. Wren shoved the small glass antidote vial against his lips. Drink. Vane swallowed the liquid instantly. The chemical rushed through his veins, stripping the neurotoxin from his blood before it could paralyze his heart. Vane rose straight up from the burned moss, his feral vitality flooding back into his frame. He didn't pick up his sword. He didn't gloat. He stalked silently over to the paralyzed Alpha Silas. Vane reached down, his hands locking onto either side of Silas's head. A wet crunch of heavy bone echoed through the foggy clearing. Silas's thrashing body went completely limp in the dirt. A freezing wind swept through the ancient redwoods. The thick green smoke drifted and faded, carrying the bitter scent of scorched earth away into the canopy. The clearing was a silent graveyard. A dozen surviving Silver Ridge guards emerged from the distant tree line. They had been waiting in the shadows for Silas's trap to spring. Now they stood frozen in terror at the lifeless body of their cruel Alpha. They dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads into the freezing dirt, cowering before the Shadow King. Vane ignored them. He stood alone amidst the bodies of his enemies, his chest heaving. Deliberately, he wiped a streak of blood from his jawline and turned to face Wren. She stood quietly near the dying embers of the fire. Her worn shirt was covered in soot and ash. She was small, scentless, and undeniably the most dangerous creature in the forest. Vane walked slowly toward her. The feral madness was gone from his eyes, replaced by deep reverence. He stopped in front of her, and the untouchable apex predator dropped heavily onto one knee in the blood-soaked soil. He reached out gently, taking her trembling fingers. He didn't claim her as a captive or treat her as a fragile peace offering. He pressed a heavy, cold band of silver firmly into her bare palm. It was Silas's alpha ring. Wren stared down at the massive chunk of silver. Slowly, she slipped it over her bruised, ash-stained finger. It was cold. It was heavy. It was absolute, unshakable power. Vane tilted his head back, his glowing eyes fixed on his mate. He opened his mouth, and a booming, forest-shaking roar erupted from his chest. The terrifying sound echoed endlessly into the mist, uniting two warring territories under the shadow of the feral king and the unyielding botanical mastery of his lethal Luna.